It's so nice to see so many familiar faces here today. Thank you, of course, to Janice and the KDocs team for inviting me and hosting this sold-out screening of Your Fat Friend. It's pretty incredible. As Janice so kindly introduced, my name is Layla Cameron, and I'm an academic, journalist, and documentary filmmaker. And I have to say, it also feels really special to be here in this particular theater with you, because my first job when I moved to Vancouver 10 years ago was for the Vancouver International Film Festival. Now, at the time, I was hired to work in sponsorship and development, and that was a fun job, but it wasn't my passion. What I really wanted to do was direct documentary films. I eventually did make my first film a few years later, and it premiered in 2018. The film is called Fat Hiking Club, and it's exactly as it sounds. It's a short film about a group of fat people hiking. Now, the inspiration from that film stemmed from my frustration with the outdoor sporting community here in Vancouver. Specifically, its steadfast dedication to the pursuit of health as defined by proximity to thinness. After I moved to the West Coast, I quickly realized that there was not a single store where I could access clothing or gear for all of the activities that I wanted to try. A lack of access to these resources, paired with what I perceived as overwhelming general disdain for fat folks, led me to wonder if I was alone in experiencing that hostility. Now, it turns out that I wasn't alone. Obviously, look around. But the closest group of people at the time that I could find to connect and commiserate with were all the way in Portland, Oregon. And so I made my way down there to meet with Summer, who's the co-founder of an organization called Fat Girls Hiking. And after meeting her, I decided to make a documentary about her story. Now, the process of making Fat Hiking Club was incredibly challenging, and that's not just because it was my first time making a film and I had a budget of $2,000. But the most challenging part of making that film was that I absolutely agonized about every decision I had to make as its director. Primarily, I was worried that people of all sizes, but especially fat people, would accuse me of relying on a good fatty narrative, or in other words, that making a film about fat people exercising was problematic and harmful. I feared that viewers would interpret the film as me trying to prove fat people's worth despite their fatness, as if to say, look how incredible we are, we can hike mountains, yet we're still fat. So I felt an immense responsibility to fat people to convey our complex experiences without relying on familiar tropes and stereotypes. And this was especially difficult because I also learned that it's very hard to make an interesting and aesthetically pleasing film about people hiking up a mountain without including things like shots of sweat pouring down your forehead, or audio of heavy breathing. So I was hyper aware that these images and sounds have been weaponized against fat people time and time again, especially in media. And there's so much pressure on projects like these because there aren't that many of them, and so they have to mean everything to everyone. Now, in the 1970s, feminist film theorist Laura Mulvey coined the term the male gaze to encapsulate how all people living under patriarchy, but especially feminine-presenting folks, are actively objectified in visual media. She argued that there cannot be other forms of gazing in a patriarchal society. However, there are some scholars and media producers who argue that an oppositional, quote-unquote, female gaze does exist, but only in very specific conditions. So according to Joey Soloway, who's perhaps most famously known as the creator of the TV show Transparent, they argue that the female gaze involves reclaiming the body and using it with the intention of communicating what they call feeling seeing. So in other words, this female gaze is possible if we use the camera to make an audience feel what feminine presenting people see, feel, and experience. And in a talk given at the Toronto International Film Festival, Soloway states that this female gaze is a, quote-unquote, socio-political, justice-demanding way of art making and returning the gaze, generating empathy rather than objectification. So in reflecting on Soloway's words, I have wrestled with this idea for literally years because I'm thinking at great length about what a fat gaze would look like. How can we both return and challenge the normative and hypercritical gaze of a fat-phobic society in a way that generates actual empathy? So often, expressions of empathy for fat people's experiences reveal an ongoing commitment to diet culture. Empathy for fat people often only goes so far in that the world may sometimes decide to be less harsh or violent towards us, but nevertheless, anti-fat ideologies persist. Now, I think a large part of my inability to define a fat gaze for myself as a filmmaker stems from the fact that as a society, we see fatness as a liminal identity. We cannot comprehend what it would mean to thrive in a fat body in the present moment. Fatness is something that is to be resisted, worked through, shredded off, and moved away from so that the real person underneath can finally live their life. Now, in my struggle to define a fat gaze, I have turned many times to the work of Aubrey Gordon, whose writing has been instrumental in helping me to conceptualize how to achieve this feeling, seeing of fat people's experiences in the world. In her work, Gordon both empowers fat folks to continue living their best lives while tearing apart fatphobic institutions and ideologies, all while simultaneously catching the attention and sometimes respect of hesitant or resistant fat phobes. And this is a remarkable thing to do, and she does this while offering fat people the opportunity to explore their humanity in increasingly vulnerable ways. Now, in 2016, Gordon published an article on Medium that I still think about often. It came out right around the time that I started developing Fat Hiking Club. And the article is titled In Defense of Fat Sadness. And in it, Gordon puts into words some of the tensions that I had never been able to articulate. She writes, I have learned not to share my sadness as a fat person. Sad fat people would show up on TV, crying and sweating, their unsavory feelings the only space they were allowed to take up. The only time fat people could be tolerated was when we renounced our bodies or made them disappear into our suffering. In the years since I made Fat Hiking Club, my work has become increasingly public-facing, and I've been called on many times to speak as a representative of a very diverse community of fat people. More often than not, what I am being asked to do is offer a rallying cry that being fat is a valid and beautiful way to exist in the world. And don't get me wrong, this is an important message that I'm very honored to contribute to, but what has felt so burdensome is this pressure to always celebrate being fat and what it means to be fat. This isn't reflective of the messy and sometimes painful experience of being a human, let alone a fat one. And so it has, for a long time, felt like I was swinging from one type of dehumanization to the other, from one where I had to fight for my humanity as a fat person to this other, more insidious form of dehumanization where I wasn't allowed to admit to having complicated feelings. Fat politics have often been reduced to a palatable narrative that doesn't make space for the violent and heartbreaking ways that I and the people that I love are often treated because of our size. Talking about these contradictions is really risky. Fat stigma and weight bias are so pervasive that we risk undoing so much of our work when we are honest. So I tried my best to capture the sentiment in Fat Hiking Club when I decided to keep in the film a 2-minute scene where Summer is driving to a hike and she whispers about what happens when someone cannot keep up with the group, or when someone experiences discomfort or decides to turn around before reaching the summit. Now, I was told by many people that this scene was awkward or too long, boring, or not useful to the plot. But it felt so important to catch the ear of fat people in the audience, to offer a gentle nod to how hard it can be to prioritize comfort and care when we are so used to pushing through our pain and punishing ourselves. So I'm now working on a second film project where I continue to grapple with these questions. What would it look like if we could make art that was by and for fat people? What would it look like if this art was received and held by non-fat folks in ways that honor the vulnerability it requires to tell our stories? How can we tell sticky, contradictory, and sometimes painful stories without detracting from how powerful and incredible and beautiful it is to be a fat person? How can we tell the truth when it has never been safe to do so? As Aubrey Gordon concludes in her article on fat sadness, it is okay to be tired. Some days you will need a rest. Some days you will feel sad, and your sadness deserves to be seen just as much as any other part of you, not because it is expected, but because it is yours. Fat people deserve the human experience of seeing our lives reflected back to us on a screen, and I'm excited to see how Jeannie Finley captured the nuances of Aubrey Gordon's life as a fat cultural icon. I also look forward to the panel following the screening, as each of these panelists have also taught me in their own ways what it means to thrive in a fat body. Now, as someone whose fat politics have grown both in this very theater and in various fat communities over the past 10 years, I truly consider it an honor and a joy to be here, again, at a sold-out screening, watching this particular film with all of you. So thank you very much for being here, and I look forward to continuing the conversation after the show.